King Adrian was an immortal king, a creature carved from the patient marble of millennia, and his kingdom was a sprawling tapestry woven with alliances, threats, and the slow, grinding machinery of power. He had found her in a library, not his grand Gothic archive, but a small human library in a border town where he'd gone to negotiate a trade dispute. She had been a scholar, a historian, writing about the intersection of mortal and immortal governance. She had looked at him not with fear, but with curiosity, with questions that challenged his assumptions. He had been surprised, delighted. For the first time in centuries, someone had seen him not as a king or a monster, but as a person with ideas worth debating. He had courted her for a year, traveling in disguise to that little town, bringing her books, arguing philosophy over terrible tea in her cluttered study. When he had asked her to be his queen, she had hesitated. She would age. She would die. Their time would be fleeting. But he had promised her that every moment would matter, that he would treasure each finite day with her. She had believed him. And for that first golden year, he had kept that promise. Maya had been Adrian's queen for 3 years now. The first year had been a dream. He had courted her with a patience that belied his immortal nature, shown her wonders, listened to her thoughts as if they were sacred texts. The second year, the cracks had begun to appear. Small absences, delayed promises. By the third year, she had become a ghost in her own castle. When he had first found Maya, she had been a flash of impossible warmth in his cold, ordered world, a wildflower breaking through the flagstones of his court. He had loved the vibrancy of her, the fierce, fleeting pulse of her humanity. He had claimed her, bound her to him not by dark magic, but by a vow that echoed in the deepest chambers of his ancient heart. He had made her his queen. And then he had forgotten to see her. The forgetting was not a singular event, but a slow erosion, the way a river grinds a mountain into sand. Centuries of existence had polished his emotions to a dull, unreflective sheen. He saw the world in epics, in dynasties and bloodlines, while she saw it in sunrises, in shared meals, in the fleeting space between one breath and the next. Her needs, once the center of his universe, became footnotes in the grand historical text he was constantly authoring. It had been 6 months since he'd kept a promise to her. 6 months of excuses, of kingdom business, of her slowly shrinking world. Maya had her own work in the castle. She had established a school for the human servants' children, had been documenting the castle's vast historical archives, translating ancient texts into modern languages. Adrian had supported these endeavors in the beginning, had even helped her, fascinated by her perspective on his own history. But slowly, he had stopped asking about her projects, stopped reading her translations. The work continued, but the sharing of it, the joy of it, had died. She stayed because she had built something here. Because leaving would mean abandoning not just him, but the small community of humans who had come to depend on her, and the faint, dying hope that the man she had fallen in love with might one day return. Tonight was a perfect example, a masterclass in his neglect. The private dining hall, a chamber of vaulted ceilings and dark, tapestried walls, was lit by the soft, golden glow of 100 candles. Maya had arranged them herself. The scent of beeswax mingled with the earthy, mineral aroma of the rare vintage blood she had selected from the royal cellars. A year from the harvest when they'd first met, one he'd once mentioned favoring. For herself, she had prepared a simple roasted quail with herbs from the castle garden, food that reminded her of her human life before this vast, cold palace. She wore a gown the color of a twilight sky, a deep, velvety blue that made the warm tones of her skin seem to burn with their own light. She had been waiting for 2 hours. When he finally arrived, he did not enter so much as he materialized from the shadows, a scroll of parchment still clutched in one hand. The weight of the kingdom clung to him like a shroud. He did not notice the candles, or the gown, or the carefully selected blood vintage, or the carefully concealed tremor in her hand as she reached for her wineglass. "The trade negotiations with the Iron Conclave have stalled," he announced, his voice a low baritone that seemed to absorb the candlelight rather than reflect it. He unrolled the parchment on the edge of the gleaming mahogany table, his eyes scanning the intricate script. "Their demands for territorial waters are preposterous, an act of aggression veiled as commerce." Maya watched him, her carefully constructed composure threatening to shatter. A muscle in her jaw fluttered. Adrian, she began, her voice softer than she intended. It will require a show of force, he continued, his thoughts already leagues away, on warships and border patrols. Nothing overt. A strategic repositioning of the Third Fleet should be sufficient. He finally looked up, his gaze sweeping over the table as if noticing it for the first time. You've prepared a meal. It was not a question, but a flat observation, devoid of warmth or appreciation. He glanced at the crystal goblet of blood she'd selected, dismissing it without recognition. I did, she said, the words tasting like ash. For us, a quiet evening. You said you would be free. Ah. He made a vague gesture with his free hand, a dismissal. Something came up. The conclave is unpredictable. This couldn't wait. He dipped a finger into his own untouched goblet of blood, tracing a pattern on the table, his mind already leagues away. Human concerns are so immediate, so loud. You must understand, my love, the concerns of a kingdom are eternal. There it was, the word that had become a wall between them. Human. He used it to explain away her loneliness, to diminish her pain, to categorize her love as something fragile and ephemeral compared to the granite permanence of his duties. She felt a familiar, hot prickle behind her eyes, the gathering of tears she had sworn she would not shed again. My concerns, she said, her voice trembling despite her best efforts, are with my husband, the one who promised to see me, to be with me. Is that so loud, Adrian? Is my loneliness an inconvenience to the state? He looked at her then, truly looked, but his eyes held the detached curiosity of a scholar examining a curious specimen. He saw the tears welling, the flush of emotion on her cheeks, and he processed it as data. Emotional distress. Source, perceived neglect. Logical response required. That is an irrational conclusion, he stated, his tone maddeningly calm. Your position is secure. Your comfort is provided for. My work ensures the stability that allows for that comfort. To neglect my duty would be to neglect you in a far more fundamental way. Can you not see the logic? Logic. He offered her logic when her heart was breaking. He offered her geopolitical strategy when she was starving for a simple, kind touch. The tears spilled over, tracing hot paths down her cheeks. She pushed her chair back, the sound scraping harshly in the quiet room. I don't want your logic, she whispered, the fight draining out of her. I just wanted you. She left him there, standing beside the cooling meal she had prepared for herself and the blood vintage he hadn't even acknowledged. Adrian watched her go, a flicker of irritation passing through him. This emotionalism was so inefficient, so dramatic. He turned back to the scroll, the weight of his kingdom settling comfortably back onto his shoulders. Her quail could be reheated. The blood could be saved for another occasion. Her feelings, he assumed, would cool on their own. He failed to understand that some things, once grown cold, could never be warmed again. He mistook the coming silence for peace, not realizing it was the sound of a heart giving up. The arguments ceased first. For months, they had been the discordant soundtrack of their lives in the castle. Maya's voice, raw with a desperate, pleading pain, colliding with the impenetrable wall of his logic. He had come to expect them, to brace for them as one braces for an unpleasant but predictable seasonal storm. He would counter her tears with facts, her accusations of neglect with detailed explanations of his responsibilities. He saw it as a tedious but necessary part of managing a human mate's emotional volatility. He always believed he was winning these exchanges, leaving her in silence with the sheer, irrefutable weight of his reasoning. His chamberlain Valerius had tried to warn him. Your Majesty, the Queen seems diminished. She no longer comes to the gardens. She has stopped her translations. The servants are concerned. Adrian had waved him off. She is adjusting to the demands of her position. It is natural. Valerius had looked at him with something like pity, but had said nothing more. The old vampire had served Adrian's father, had seen this pattern before. He knew the warning would not be heeded until the damage was already done. Then the pleas vanished. The notes left on his desk, begging for an hour of his time, disappeared. The hopeful glances she would send him across the cavernous throne room, glances he had grown adept at ignoring, were no longer sent. Her efforts to create moments for them, a walk in the moon-drenched gardens, a rare vintage of blood she'd found for him, a book of poetry she wanted to read aloud, all of it just stopped. It was her anniversary of arriving at the court, a day she had always marked with a quiet, joyful reverence. For the past year she had been dropping hints, speaking of the first time she had seen the obsidian towers of his citadel against the crimson sunset. She spoke of the awe, the fear, and the impossible, terrifying hope. Adrian had registered the words, filed them away under sentimental human milestone, and promptly buried them under a mountain of more pressing concerns, like a border dispute with a werewolf pack and a blight affecting the subterranean mushroom farms that fed his vampiric subjects. On the evening of the anniversary, he was in the war room, a circular chamber where a map of the continent was inlaid in glowing lodestone on a massive stone table. His generals, ancient and grim-faced, stood around it, moving markers representing battalions and supply lines. He was deep in the intricate dance of strategy, a world of clean lines and predictable outcomes, when his chamberlain cleared his throat. "Your Majesty," the old vampire murmured, his voice like rustling leaves. "The Queen is in the Celestial Observatory. She has been there for some hours." Adrian frowned, annoyed at the interruption. "And?" "She requested your presence, Your Majesty. She said she hoped you would remember the stars." A faint memory stirred. Their first night together, he had taken her to the observatory and shown her the constellations of the winter sky, naming the dead stars and forgotten gods of his people. A foolishly romantic gesture, he thought now. Impractical. "I am occupied, Valerius. The wolves of the Ashenwood are testing our borders. This is not the time for stargazing." Valerius bowed his head, his face a mask of neutrality. But Adrian caught the flicker of something, pity, in his ancient eyes before he retreated. The king turned back to the map, but the clean lines of strategy suddenly seemed blurred. The memory of her face, illuminated by the starlight in the observatory, superimposed itself over the glowing lodestone. The look of wonder, of absolute trust. He pushed it away and spent another 3 hours planning troop movements. When he finally retired to their chambers, long after the moon had begun its descent, he found her sitting by the window, not in a gown for a celebration, but in a simple, practical day dress. She was reading. She looked up as he entered, and her expression was placid, serene. There was no trace of disappointment, no unshed tears in her eyes. "Good evening, Adrian," she said, her voice even and calm. "I trust your meeting was productive?" The lack of accusation, of hurt, was more unsettling than any argument would have been. "It was," he said slowly, watching her. "The Ashenwood pack will trouble us no more." "That is good to hear." She marked her page with a ribbon of silk and closed the book. "The kingdom is fortunate to have you." She stood, smoothed her dress, and prepared for bed with a quiet efficiency that unnerved him. There was no hesitation, no waiting for him to come to her, to offer a belated apology or a hollow excuse. She simply moved through the familiar motions of her evening routine as if he were a piece of furniture, a part of the room's architecture, and nothing more. That was the moment the silence began in earnest. It was not an angry silence, filled with unspoken recriminations. It was an empty silence, a void. It was the sound of a door that had been gently, but firmly, closed. He had spent months proving to her that his kingdom came first. He had not considered what would happen when she finally believed him. He had stood on the battlements of his logic, defending his choices, and had never once looked down to see that the person he was supposedly protecting had already walked away. The battle was over. He had won, and he was utterly, terrifyingly alone. 5 weeks passed, then 6. The silence stretched into its second month. At first, Adrian found it a relief. The castle felt efficient. His days were uncluttered by the unpredictable tides of Maya's emotions. he could focus entirely on the intricate, logical patterns of governance. He finalized the trade agreement with the Iron Conclave, quelled the Ashenwood border dispute with a single decisive maneuver, and redesigned the city's aqueduct system. He was a paragon of kingly competence. And he had never been more miserable. The silence was not peace. He began to realize it was an absence, a negative space that reshaped everything around it. The grand halls, which had once seemed majestic, now felt cavernous and empty. The throne, his seat of power, felt cold. He would find himself listening for the sound of her laughter in the gardens, a sound he hadn't truly heard in months, but now missed with an ache that was sharp and physical. He missed the scent of the jasmine tea she favored, the chaotic pile of books she left by her side of the bed, the way she would hum slightly off-key when she was arranging flowers. He found himself standing outside her chambers at odd hours, catching the scent of her, jasmine and warm skin, and the steady, mortal pulse of blood beneath. A scent that should have been merely sustenance, but had become his definition of home. He began to seek her out, manufacturing reasons to be where she was. He would visit the library, a place he hadn't set foot in for decades, under the pretense of researching ancient bloodlines. He would find her there, curled in a window seat, the afternoon light turning the pages of her book to gold. She would look up, offer him a small, polite smile, and then her attention would return to the printed words, leaving him standing uselessly among the towering shelves. The smile was the worst part. It was a perfect, courteous thing, as beautiful and as lifeless as a pressed flower. He tried to engage her in conversation. "That is a fascinating text," he said one afternoon, gesturing to the book in her lap. "A history of the prelapsarian Fey courts. Dry for most." "I find it interesting," she replied, her voice pleasant, neutral. Their social structures were quite complex. Indeed, he waited, hoping she would elaborate, would offer an opinion, an argument, anything. She simply turned a page. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. He was the most powerful being for 1,000 miles, a king whose whisper could command armies, and he could not elicit more than a handful of placid syllables from his own wife. The wrongness of it all began to curdle in his gut, a cold dread that his immortality could not numb. This was not the quiet contentment of a resolved issue. This was the quiet of a battlefield after the slaughter. He had vanquished her passion, her fire, her fight. And in doing so, he had extinguished the very light that had drawn him to her. The wildflower had not broken through the flagstones. He had paved over it with the heavy, unyielding stone of his own indifference. The breaking point came on a storm-lashed night, 3 months after the silence had begun. Rain hammered against the stained glass windows of their chambers, and the wind howled like a grieving beast. The storm matched the tempest inside him. He couldn't bear it another moment. He found her in the solar, sketching the storm-tossed trees in a charcoal pad. Her focus was absolute, her hand steady. He stood before her, his massive frame blocking the flickering firelight. She didn't look up immediately, finishing a delicate line of shadow on a branch. When she finally raised her eyes, they held no surprise, no fear, only a mild, questioning patience. "We need to talk," he said, the words feeling clumsy and brutish in his own mouth. "All right," she said, setting her sketchbook aside. Her calm acquiescence was more enraging than any defiance. "Stop it," he snarled, the sound torn from him, raw and desperate. His eyes flashed that predatory crimson they turned when his emotions ran high, the ancient vampire breaking through the veneer of civilization. But she was not afraid. She had stopped being afraid of the monster in him long ago. It was the man who had the power to hurt her. "Just stop it. Stop being so calm, so polite. Yell at me, scream. Throw something. Tell me I am a monster, a fool, a heartless bastard. Say something." He was pleading, the great and terrible King Adrian, begging for the emotional storm he had once found so tedious. He craved the chaos, the pain, the evidence that she still felt something, anything, for him. Maya looked at him, and her gaze was clear, steady, and utterly devoid of the fire he was desperate to see. She tilted her head, a gesture of genuine, dispassionate curiosity. "Why would I do that?" she asked, her voice as quiet as the heart of the storm. "It would be a waste of energy." "Because you hate me!" he roared, gesturing wildly around the room. "Because I have ignored you, dismissed you, broken every promise I ever made to you. You have every right to hate me." A long moment passed. The only sounds were the fire, the rain, and the frantic, useless beating of his own dead heart. Then she gave a small, sad shake of her head. The look on her face wasn't anger, it was pity. "Oh, Adrian," she said, and the softness of her tone was the most devastating blow he had ever received. "I'm not angry anymore." She took a small breath, her eyes meeting his without a flicker of evasion. "I've stopped hoping. There's a difference, Adrian. I still care, that's why it hurts so much. But I've stopped believing you'll change. I've accepted that this is who you are, and I'm learning to live with the pain instead of fighting against it." The words struck him with the force of a physical impact. The world tilted, the ornate patterns on the carpet swirling into a meaningless vortex. He felt a coldness spread through him that had nothing to do with his vampiric nature. It was the absolute, soul-deep chill of utter loss. He had thought her love was a fortress, an unassailable feature of his landscape. He had believed he could neglect its defenses, ignore its upkeep, and it would simply always be there. He had been a fool, an immortal, arrogant fool. He hadn't just neglected her love, he had starved it. He had stood by and watched it die of thirst, and had only noticed when he finally felt the parched, desolate emptiness of the space it had once occupied. Her words were not a weapon she was wielding against him. They were a tombstone, and beneath it lay everything that had ever mattered. The world had fractured. Adrian saw the pieces of his existence lying around him, glinting and sharp. For centuries, he had defined himself by his power, his control, his reign. His kingdom was an extension of his will, a monument to his permanence. Now, he saw it for what it was, a vast, intricate, and utterly hollow shell. The heart of it, the small, warm, human core that had given it meaning, had gone still. Maya's withdrawn hope had not just broken him, it had recontextualized his entire immortal life. What was the point of an eternal kingdom if its halls echoed with an eternal silence? His first instinct was the one he had always relied upon: power. He could command her to feel, to try, to love him again, but he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that love could not be commanded. It could not be bought with jewels or titles. He had tried to secure her with logic and provision, and it had failed. Grand gestures would be just as useless. He couldn't fix this with the tools of a king. He had to learn to use the tools of a man. He began by observing, not as a king observing a subject, but as a penitent studying a sacred text he had failed to read. He watched Maya as she moved through her days. He saw the way she spoke with quiet kindness to the serving staff, the genuine interest she took in the lives of the gardeners and the stable hands. He saw the small, solitary pleasures she had carved out for herself, the first bloom of the moon-petal rose in the West Garden, the discovery of a rare book of poetry in the archives, the way she would stand on the battlements at twilight and watch the last light fade, a lone figure silhouetted against the dying day. He saw, with a clarity that was agony, how completely she had built a life that did not include him. She wasn't waiting for him. She wasn't leaving a space for him to fill. She had accepted his absence and had painstakingly, bravely, learned to live within it. The realization was a knife in his chest, twisting with every small, independent joy he witnessed. His first attempt to bridge the chasm was clumsy, a relic of his old way of thinking. He recalled her once mentioning a fondness for sapphires. He had the royal jewelers craft a necklace of staggering beauty, a river of midnight blue stones that captured the light of dying stars. He presented it to her one evening, laid out on a bed of black velvet. She looked at the necklace, then at him. "It's beautiful, Adrian," she said, her voice holding the same polite warmth she might use to compliment a well-polished suit of armor. Thank you. She allowed him to fasten it around her neck, but her skin was cool and unresponsive beneath his touch. She wore it to dinner, a glittering, magnificent symbol of his failure. It was a king's gift, a payment, a bribe. It had nothing to do with the heart of the matter. It was just another beautiful, cold thing in a castle full of them. He knew then that he had to start smaller. He had to learn her language, not the one she spoke with her lips, but the one she lived. He remembered her mentioning, months ago, that the inkwell on her writing desk was prone to tipping. He had dismissed it at the time. The next day, he spent hours in the royal workshop with the master carpenter, not commanding, but working. He learned the feel of the wood, the patient process of shaping it. He designed and helped carve a small, elegant stand for her desk, weighted with lead at the base, with an inlay of mother-of-pearl that echoed the patterns on her favorite teacup. He left it on her desk while she was out walking. He didn't wait for thanks, he just left it there, a small, silent offering. When he saw her later, she said, "Nothing about it." But when he passed her study that evening, he saw it in use, the inkwell sitting securely in its new home. It was not a victory, but it was not nothing. It was the first stone he had laid in the foundation of a bridge he wasn't sure he could ever complete. For 4 months, Adrian worked, not with the impatience of a king demanding results, but with the steady, humble persistence of a man planting a garden he might never see bloom. He kept at it. He learned the names of the flowers in the garden she tended. He would bring her a single, perfect blossom. Not a grand bouquet, just one. A snowdrop, a night phlox, a crimson heart's ease. He would leave it on her pillow or beside her breakfast plate. He started reading the books she read, not so he could debate their contents with her, but so he could understand the world she chose to inhabit. He would find passages she might like and leave the book open for her. He was unfailingly present. He canceled non-essential council meetings. He delegated tasks he had once guarded jealously. He made sure he was there for breakfast, for dinner, for the quiet hours in between. He began taking his meals in her presence again, not hiding the reality of what he was. He would drink his blood from crystal while she ate her human food, and they would talk, bridging the gap between their natures with words instead of pretending the gap didn't exist. He didn't force conversation. He just created the space for it. Sitting with her in the library, each of them reading their own book, sharing the silence that had once been a void, but was now, slowly, becoming something else. It was still silence, but it was a shared silence. And that felt like a beginning. The turning point, the first crack in the ice of her withdrawn hope, came not from a success, but from a profound, well-intentioned failure. He remembered how much she had loved the sweet, spiced pastries from a particular bakery in the lower city, a place they had visited together in the early days, disguised as commoners. It had been one of her most cherished memories. He decided to recreate them for her. He, who had never prepared a meal in his 1,000-year existence, commandeered the royal kitchens. He dismissed the baffled chefs and, following a recipe he'd had a scribe procure, proceeded to create a culinary disaster. He was covered in flour, his black tunic dusted white. He burned the first batch, undercooked the second, and the third looked vaguely like the pastries in question, but tasted, as he discovered, of despair and cardamom. He stood before her covered in flour, and the domesticity of it, this ancient predator, this creature of blood and night, dusted in white powder from attempting to bake, was so absurd, so heartbreakingly genuine, that something in her began to crack. He brought the plate of misshapen, slightly scorched pastries to her, feeling more vulnerable than he had when facing down entire armies. He set them before her. She sat in the garden. "I remembered you liked these," he said, his voice quiet. "I tried to make them." Maya looked from the pathetic pastries to his flour-smudged face and his formal tunic, now a baker's apron in all but name. She stared at the plate for a long, silent moment. He expected politeness, a gentle refusal. He expected indifference. What he got was a shuddering breath. Her hands clenched in her lap. When she looked up at him, her eyes were no longer placid or empty. They were blazing. 2 bright, hot tears spilled from her eyes, followed by another. "How dare you?" she whispered, her voice thick with a pain so raw it stunned him. "How dare you do this now?" She stood up, her chair scraping back violently. "Where was this man?" she demanded, her voice rising, cracking with the force of her resurrected grief. "Where was the man who would cover himself in flour for me a year ago, 6 months ago, when I was starving for a crumb of your attention? When I cried myself to sleep in our bed while you rewrote trade laws? You made me believe again. You made me hope. And hope is the cruelest thing you could give me now, because when you inevitably go back to who you were, it will destroy me all over again. How dare you give me hope?" The dam of her composure had broken, and a flood of agony poured out, a torrent of every hurt, every dismissal, every lonely night. She was finally yelling at him. She was finally screaming. And it was the most beautiful, terrible sound he had ever heard. He did not defend himself. He did not offer logic or excuses. He just stood there, a statue of a king covered in the evidence of his clumsy, belated effort, and let her words wash over him. He let them flay him, strip him down to the bone. He deserved every single one. When her voice finally broke, when she was left gasping for breath, tears streaming down her face, he took a step forward. "You are right," he said, his own voice hoarse with an emotion he couldn't name. "You are right about all of it. I have no excuse. I was a fool, and I am so sorry." It was the first time she had ever heard him apologize. Not for an inconvenience, but for the wound itself. The anger in her eyes flickered, replaced by a wave of confusion and exhaustion. She sank back into her chair, burying her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. He wanted to reach out, to touch her, to comfort her, but he knew he hadn't earned that right. Not yet. He had spent months trying to get a reaction from her, any reaction at all. Now he had it. He had her anger. He had her pain. It was a terrible, precious gift. And as he stood there, watching the woman he loved finally grieve the love he had killed, he felt the first, terrifying flicker of hope. Anger was not apathy. Anger was a connection. It was a fire. And a fire, even one born of rage and grief, could be tended. It could, perhaps, one day, become warmth again. The storm had broken, and in its wake, the landscape was altered. Maya's anger was not a fleeting squall. It was a lingering, charged atmosphere that filled the castle. Her politeness was gone, replaced by a brittle, watchful tension. She spoke to him when necessary, her words clipped and precise. She no longer avoided him, but when they were in the same room, she watched him with an unnerving intensity, as if trying to solve a puzzle she was certain was a trick. For Adrian, this was infinitely preferable to the void. Her anger was a signpost, a landmark in the desolate country of her heart. It told him where the wounds were. The true test of his transformation, the crucible in which his newfound resolve would be forged or shattered, arrived not in their quiet chambers, but in the heart of his kingdom's power. A delegation from the Shadow Syndicate, a clandestine and notoriously volatile power from the southern continent, had arrived unannounced. They brought with them a threat veiled as an offer, one that could destabilize a century of peace. His entire council was in a state of barely controlled panic. His presence was not just requested, it was demanded. "They will only speak to you, Your Majesty," General Kale, his oldest and most trusted advisor, insisted, his granite face etched with worry. They are in the obsidian chamber. They have been waiting for an hour. This is a delicate moment. A single misstep could mean war. Adrian was old enough, powerful enough, that daylight merely weakened him rather than destroyed him. He could walk in the sun, though it drained him, made him slower, more vulnerable. In his early years with Maya, he had done so often, treasuring her delight in sharing the pre-dawn hours with him, watching as the world shifted from his realm to hers. But as the years passed, he had stopped enduring the discomfort, stopped making the sacrifice. Adrian stood by the grand oriel window, looking out not at the courtyard where the syndicate's monstrous steeds stamped and snorted, but toward the eastern battlements. He had promised Maya he would watch the pre-dawn sky with her from there, that liminal hour between darkness and light. It was a promise he had made and broken half a dozen times in the past, a casual casualty of some minor crisis or another. This time, he had sworn it would be different. The pre-dawn hour was less than 40 minutes away. "My king," Cale pressed, his voice tight, "your kingdom needs you." For the first time in his long life, Adrian felt the weight of his crown, not as a symbol of power, but as a chain. He heard the echo of Maya's voice, raw with pain. "Where were you then?" He had always been where Cale was now, in the war rooms, the council chambers, the heart of the machine. He had always chosen the kingdom. He looked at his general's anxious face, at the palpable fear of his council members gathered in the doorway, and he saw the choice laid bare before him. It was the same choice he had always made, the one that had led him to this precipice of loss. He turned from the window, his expression calm and resolute. "The syndicate is accustomed to waiting," he said, his voice carrying the effortless authority of his station. "Their impatience is a negotiating tactic. Let them practice it a while longer. You and Lord Valerius are more than capable of handling the preliminary courtesies. Find out what they truly want, beyond the posturing. I will join you after the sun has threatened the horizon." A collective gasp went through the assembled council. Cale looked as if Adrian had just suggested they surrender the kingdom outright. "After the pre-dawn? My king, that is an insult. They could walk away." "If our kingdom's stability is so fragile that it cannot survive a few hours of diplomatic theater, then we have already lost," Adrian replied, his voice leaving no room for argument. He met Cale's gaze, and for the first time, he let his advisor see not just the king, but the man. "There is another duty I must attend to, one I have neglected for far too long." He swept past them, ignoring their sputtering protests and looks of disbelief. He walked through the silent, torchlit halls of his castle, every step a deliberate renunciation of his old self. He was shedding the skin of the king who put duty before all else, because he had learned, in the most brutal way imaginable, that his most important duty was not to a map or a treaty, but to the keeper of his heart. He found Maya on the eastern battlement in the deep indigo hour before dawn. The moon was still visible, a pale ghost sinking toward the western horizon, while the eastern sky had just begun to pale from black to the darkest blue. She was wrapped in a heavy cloak, her face turned toward that dangerous, brightening horizon. She didn't turn as he approached, her posture rigid. She had come, but she had not come with hope. She had come to confirm a disappointment, to add another piece of evidence to the case against him. He came to stand beside her, not touching, leaving a small, respectful space between them. For a long time they stood in silence, watching the stars fade and the sky shift from indigo to violet to the palest rose. "I thought you would be in the obsidian chamber," she said finally, her voice quiet, not looking at him. "I heard the syndicate had arrived." "They can wait," he said simply. She turned her head then, her eyes searching his face in the pre-dawn gloom. The eastern sky was growing dangerously bright now, the blue giving way to gold. He should retreat. He should return to the safety of the castle's shadows before the sun broke the horizon. But he stood there, steadfast, his jaw tight against the instinctive fear of the coming light. He would stay with her until the last possible moment. He was choosing this. He was choosing her. As the very first sliver of the sun touched the distant mountains, he finally stepped back into the doorway's shadow, but his eyes never left her face. She stood in the threshold between their worlds, bathed in the light he could never fully share. And for the first time in months, she was not alone in that space. He had come as close as his nature would allow. He stood beside her as the sun rose, feeling its light sap his strength, the familiar discomfort settling into his bones like a weight. But he didn't move, didn't retreat further into shadow. He endured it, because she was worth every moment of pain. A flicker of something complex and fragile moved across her face. It wasn't forgiveness. It was a bewildered, hesitant confusion. This action did not compute with the man who had let her love die. He had stayed until the sun itself forced him to retreat, had chosen to spend the last precious moments of darkness with her, rather than with his kingdom's crisis. It was a new piece of data, one that didn't fit the established pattern. As the sun climbed higher and he finally had to retreat fully into the shaded corridor, the light caught the unshed tears in her eyes, turning them to liquid gold. She didn't speak. She just watched the sunrise. And for the first time in a very long time, she was not alone. He had made a promise, and in the face of war and political crisis, he had kept it. It was a single, quiet act, but it was more powerful than any jewel, more meaningful than any decree. It was a choice, and it was the first ray of a new and terrifying dawn in her own heart. When Adrian finally joined his council 4 hours later, well after the sun was high in the sky and he had to navigate the castle's carefully shaded corridors, the syndicate's representatives were furious at the wait. But Adrian negotiated from a different place than he ever had before. He was no longer desperate to prove his power, his control. He was a man who had just chosen love over duty, and somehow that made him a better king. He saw through their bluster to the genuine concerns beneath. By nightfall, they had not only averted war, but had crafted a treaty more favorable than any his advisors had dared hope for. Cale looked at him with newfound respect. "Perhaps, my king, your priorities were not so misplaced after all." The sunrise on the battlement was not a resolution, it was a question. Maya's carefully constructed defenses, built of withdrawn hope and righteous anger, had been breached by a single, undeniable act of presence. The question it posed was terrifying. Could she dare to hope again? Hope was a dangerous, fragile thing. It had almost destroyed her once, and the thought of nurturing it back to life, only to have it wither again, was a prospect she wasn't sure she could survive. So she began to test him. Her tests were not grand or dramatic, but small, subtle things, woven into the fabric of their days. She would mention in passing a desire to taste the honeymead from the northern apiaries, a place hundreds of leagues away, a journey of weeks for a human merchant. She didn't ask him to get it, she just mentioned it, a fleeting thought voiced, aloud, and then she watched. In the past, such a comment would have passed him by completely, unheard or immediately forgotten. 3 days later, a chilled flagon of the golden liquid was at her place for dinner. A royal courier had been dispatched, flying through the night on one of the king's great bats to fetch it for her. He didn't make a show of it, the flagon was just there. When she looked at him, a question in her eyes, he simply said, "I thought you might enjoy it." When Maya found the honey mead at dinner 3 days after mentioning it, she stared at the amber liquid for a long moment. Her first thought was suspicion. Was this a grand gesture, a performance? But there was no fanfare, no servants watching for her reaction, no Adrian hovering for gratitude. It had simply appeared, as quietly and naturally as the pre-dawn stars. She poured a glass, tasted the sweet, complex flavor, and felt something shift in her chest. It was small. It might mean nothing. But he had heard her. That counted for something. She began leaving books open, with passages underlined that had moved or troubled her. She would return to find a corresponding passage marked in another book, left for her. a silent conversation across pages and centuries. He was not just paying attention to her words, but to the movements of her mind, the inclinations of her soul. One afternoon, she found him in the vast, echoing portrait gallery, a place he rarely frequented. He was standing before the oldest portrait, a severe, unsmiling painting of his own father, a tyrannical king from a brutal age. He had been thinking about his father for weeks, about the way the old king had ruled with an iron fist and a frozen heart, about the way Adrian had sworn to be different, and had somehow, slowly, become exactly the same. He had never spoken of his father to anyone, had locked those memories away in a vault he never opened. But if he wanted Maya to trust him with her pain, he had to trust her with his own. "I hated him," Adrian said, without turning around. He knew she was there. He seemed to be learning to sense her presence in a way he never had before, as if she were a magnetic pole and he the needle of a compass. He saw love as a weakness, emotion as a flaw. He ruled for 500 years, and in all that time, I never once saw him show a moment of tenderness to my mother. He believed a kingdom was a machine, and a king was its chief mechanic. Feelings only clogged the gears. He turned to face her, and the vulnerability in his eyes was startling. "I spent my first few centuries trying to be everything he was not, and then I grew old. I saw so much loss, so much change. The faces I loved turned to dust. It became easier to turn off, to see the logic, to manage the machine. I became him, Maya. In my own way, I became the very thing I despised. I am a vampire," he said quietly. "Death is my nature. But I forgot that love is also supposed to be part of that nature, the ability to protect what we cherish. I protected you from every physical threat, assassins, political rivals, the dangers of my world. But I never protected you from the one thing that could truly harm you, my own neglect." He wasn't making an excuse. He was offering a confession. He was showing her the broken parts of himself, the fear and the damage that had led to his coldness. He was trusting her with his own pain. She walked slowly toward him until she was standing before him, close enough to feel the faint coolness that radiated from his skin. She looked from his face to the portrait of his father, seeing the faint resemblance in the hard line of the jaw, but seeing the profound difference in the eyes. His father's were empty. Adrian's were filled with a terrible, self-aware grief. Instinctively, she lifted a hand and gently touched his cheek. His skin was cool, smooth as river stone, but he was not made of stone. He closed his eyes at her touch, a faint tremor running through his powerful frame. He leaned into her hand, a silent surrender. It was the first time she had touched him with affection, with anything other than polite distance since the silence had begun. It was a small gesture, but it felt momentous, a tectonic shift in the landscape of their lives. "You are not him," she whispered. The words were for both of them. From that moment, something began to thaw. They started talking again, really talking. She told him about her loneliness, describing the crushing weight of the castle's grandeur when there was no one to share it with. He listened, not offering solutions, but simply hearing her, validating her experience. He told her about his own fears, the existential weariness that came with immortality, the terror of watching everything you love turn to dust. They found a new rhythm. They would spend hours in the gardens, not just walking, but working together, his preternatural strength making the heavy work easy, her gentle touch guiding the planting of fragile seedlings. They rediscovered a shared sense of humor, dry and quiet. A small, unforced laugh over a clumsy gardener or a pompous courtier felt like a miracle. Each shared smile, each moment of easy companionship, was a stitch repairing the torn fabric of their intimacy. She set down her trowel one afternoon and looked at him directly. "Adrian, I need to know something. This new version of us you're building, it has an expiration date. I'll age, I'll die, you'll go on. Have you thought about that?" He was quiet for a long moment, his hands stilling in the dark earth. "Every day," he admitted. "I think about it every single day. You could be turned, become immortal. I would give you that if you asked." "But you're not asking me to," she said, surprised. "No," he said firmly. "Not anymore. I want you to choose your own life, even if that life is finite. Even if it means I will lose you. I would rather have 30 mortal years with you, truly with you, than an eternity with a shell of you who resented the choice I forced upon her." It was, perhaps, the most loving thing he had ever said to her. Hope, once a terrifying prospect, was beginning to feel less like a risk and more like a quiet, moonlit path opening before her. She was beginning to believe that the man who had covered himself in flour was not an aberration. He was a promise he was keeping, day after day. The final wall around Maya's heart was not built of anger, but of fear. It was the fear that this was all temporary, a grand campaign to win her back, and that once she capitulated, the old Adrian would return. The king would reassert himself over the man, and the silence would descend once more. She needed to know that this change was not just deep, but permanent. She needed to see him integrate the man he was becoming with the king he had to be. 8 months after the flower pastries, after the sunrise on the battlement, after 100 small moments of presence, the annual Sovereign's Conclave arrived. It was a week-long affair of politics, posturing, and intricate ceremony, held this year in Adrian's own capital. In the past, he would have been consumed by it, a distant, formidable figure moving through a sea of monarchs, with Maya a beautiful but silent ornament on his arm. This year, everything was different. From the moment the first delegation arrived, Adrian kept her at his side not as a symbol, but as a partner. He introduced her not just as his queen, but as his wisest counsel. When the notoriously sharp-tongued elven queen tried to corner him on a complex trade issue, he deferred to Maya. "My queen has studied this matter more closely than I. Maya, what are your thoughts on the Fae's proposal regarding the river tariffs?" Maya, who had indeed been studying the treaty at his encouragement, was startled but composed. She gave a clear, insightful analysis that not only impressed the elven queen, but also subtly reshaped the entire negotiation in their favor. Adrian watched her, his expression one of open pride. He was not using her, he was empowering her. He was showing his entire world that her voice mattered, not just to him, but to the kingdom. The true moment of revelation occurred during the grand ball, the pinnacle of the conclave. The great hall was a dizzying spectacle of wealth and power. Music soared to the rafters, and jewels glittered like captured constellations. Adrian was in deep conversation with the dwarven High Thane and the Archlich of the Western Necropolis, two of the most powerful and difficult beings on the continent. It was a critical discussion about border rights and the flow of magical energies, the kind of conversation that had once made him forget her existence for an entire evening. Across the room, Maya was accosted by a visiting human duke, a lecherous, arrogant man who saw her as nothing more than a king's beautiful pet. He cornered her near a balcony, his words slick with false courtesy, his eyes roaming over her in a way that made her skin crawl. He was pressing too close, his hand reaching to take her arm. In the past, Adrian would not have noticed. His focus would have been absolute. But now, it was as if a part of his consciousness was perpetually attuned to her. In the middle of a sentence about ley line convergence, he stopped. His head turned, his eyes scanning the crowd until they found her. He saw the Duke, the predatory posture, the look of distress that flickered across Maya's face before she could mask it. Without a word of apology or explanation to the two immensely powerful rulers he was speaking with, he turned and walked away from them. He moved through the crowded ballroom with a fluid, lethal grace that parted the sea of courtiers before him. He did not rush. He did not raise his voice. He simply moved with the unstoppable force of a glacier. He reached the balcony just as the Duke's fingers were about to close on Maya's arm. Adrian didn't touch the man. He simply placed himself between the Duke and Maya, his body a silent, immovable shield. He looked down at the Duke, and the sheer, ancient power that radiated from him was suffocating. The temperature around them seemed to drop by 20 degrees. His eyes held a crimson gleam, the predator barely restrained. "Duke," Adrian said, his voice a soft, deadly purr. "You seem to have lost your way. The kennels are on the other side of the castle. I suggest you find them." The Duke paled, stammered an apology, and practically fled, melting into the crowd. Adrian turned to Maya, the terrifying aura of the immortal king vanishing as if it had never been. His eyes were soft, filled only with concern for her. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. She could only nod, her heart hammering in her chest. It wasn't that he had protected her. He had always been capable of that. It was how he had done it. He had been in the middle of the most important political conversation of the year, and he had dropped it all without a second's hesitation, because he saw that she was uncomfortable. He had put her well-being, her very comfort, above the fate of nations. He gently took her hand. "Come," he said. "Let us leave them to their games. The stars are out. I would rather see them with you." He led her from the grand ballroom, away from the music and the politics and the weight of his world. He led her into the quiet of the night, to a small, hidden garden where the only light came from the moon and the stars. He had chosen her. Not once, on a battlement before sunrise, but again, in a room full of kings and queens. He chose her easily, reflexively, as if there were no other choice to be made. She stopped in the center of the garden and turned to him. The moonlight silvered his dark hair and softened the harsh lines of his face. She saw him then, all of him. The ancient, powerful king, the penitent, loving man, and the new person he was becoming, a fusion of the two. "Adrian," she began, her voice thick with emotion. He silenced her by gently placing a finger on her lips. "I love you, Maya," he said, his voice raw with the truth of it. "Not as a possession, not as a comfort. I love you as the center of my world. It took me centuries to learn what that meant. I will spend the rest of eternity proving it to you, if you will let me." The last of her fear washed away on the tide of his sincerity. The love she had felt for him, the love she had grieved and buried, was not gone. It had been waiting, dormant, for the rain to come. And here he was, this impossible man, this ancient king, and he was the rain. She reached up, wrapping her arms around his neck and pulled his face down to hers. "I love you," she whispered against his lips. And then she kissed him. It was not a kiss of forgiveness for the past, but a kiss of promise for the future. It was the first kiss of their new life. A life they would build together, not on the assumptions of permanence, but on the conscious, daily choice to love, to see, and to be present. After she pulled back slightly, looking into his ancient, storm-gray eyes, she said, "I need you to know that I'm still scared, that this is fragile, that I'm choosing to trust you, but trust has to be earned every day." "I know," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "and I will earn it, every day, for as long as you give me." She smiled, a real smile, tentative but genuine. "Then I suppose we'd better get started." The foundation was no longer stone, cold and unyielding. It was something far stronger. A love that had been lost, fought for, and deliberately, tenderly rebuilt. And they would build it together, one moonrise at a time, one shared silence at a time, one conscious choice at a time.